Silent Guests. Chapter 6. Hidden Histories. Lucy woke to footsteps outside her bedroom. At first, she mistook them for the ordinary sounds of Ravensmere House settling into morning. The building had its own rhythm now, one she had begun to recognize despite having spent barely 2 nights beneath its roof. Pipes clicked softly behind the walls when the heating stirred. Floorboards answered changes in temperature with muted complaints. Rain, when it came, moved differently against each window, depending on the direction of the wind. These footsteps were not part of that rhythm. They were slow, measured, close enough that Lucy could hear the faint compression of carpet beneath each step. She opened her eyes and remained still. The room was gray with early light. Beyond the curtains, the storm had finally weakened, leaving only the occasional drip from the guttering and the distant movement of the sea below the cliffs. Lucy turned towards the small clock on the bedside table. 6:17. The footsteps stopped. Not outside her room. Farther along the corridor, near Arthur's study. She pushed back the quilt and crossed the room without switching on a lamp. The floorboards were cold beneath her feet. She reached the door, rested one hand against the brass handle and listened. Nothing. For a moment she wondered whether grief, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination had combined to create the sound. Then came the soft metallic touch of something meeting a lock. Lucy opened the door. The corridor stretched toward the gallery beneath a dim wash of morning light. Most of the wall lamps had been extinguished overnight, leaving the portraits and dark oak paneling half concealed by shadow. At the far end, beside the closed door of Arthur Pembroke's study, stood a figure. Lucy saw only the outline, a dark dressing gown or long coat, one hand near the lock. The figure turned. For a fraction of a second, they faced one another across the corridor, though the poor light concealed every useful detail. Lucy caught the impression of a pale face, a shoulder drawing back, and perhaps the glint of something held in one hand. Then the figure moved, not towards the main staircase, but through a narrow door in the paneling beside the study. Lucy had noticed the door before, although she had assumed it opened into a cupboard. It closed almost silently behind whoever had entered. "Wait!" Her voice sounded unnaturally loud. She hurried along the corridor, reaching the paneled door within seconds. The brass handle turned beneath her hand. Beyond it lay a narrow servant's staircase. The stairs descended steeply into darkness, turning sharply after the first landing. No one remained in sight, but Lucy heard movement below. A quick sequence of footfalls, then another door opening somewhere on the ground floor. "Hello?" Only silence answered. She stood at the top of the staircase, one hand resting on the frame. The air rising from below smelled faintly of stone, dust, and old cooking fires. Whoever had been outside Arthur's study had known this route existed. They had also known it would allow them to leave the corridor without crossing the main gallery. Lucy looked back towards the study door. Oliver had locked it the previous evening. The brass key had remained in his possession. She moved closer and examined the lock without touching it. Nothing appeared damaged. The door remained firmly closed. On the carpet below the handle lay something small and white. Lucy crouched. It was a flower petal, not fresh. It had been flattened almost completely, its edges browned with age. The petal might have come from any book in Ravensmere House, yet the sight of it immediately pulled her thoughts towards Amelia's portrait and the flowers pressed into the pages of every book she loved. Lucy did not pick it up. Instead, she returned to her room, dressed quickly, and went in search of Oliver. She found him in the entrance hall shortly before 7, standing beside the tall windows with a mug of coffee in one hand and his notebook open in the other. He had changed clothes, but his face carried the dull fatigue of someone who had spent most of the night thinking rather than sleeping. "You're awake early," he said. "So is someone else?" Oliver looked up. Lucy told him exactly what she had heard and seen, resisting the urge to improve uncertain details. She described the figure's height only as average, because anything more would be invention. She could not identify gender, clothing, or hair. She could not be certain what the person had held. The only facts she trusted were that someone had stood beside Arthur's study at 6:17, appeared to touch the lock, and escaped through the servant's staircase when discovered. Oliver listened without interruption. "The petal is still there?" he asked. "Yes." Good. He closed the notebook. Show me. They returned upstairs together. The corridor seemed far less threatening in the growing daylight, though the study door and the narrow panel beside it now appeared connected in a way Lucy had not previously considered. Oliver crouched to examine the pedal. Could have been carried in on someone's shoe, he said. It could. Could have fallen from a book. Yes. Could mean absolutely nothing. Lucy folded her arms. You always this cheerful before breakfast? It prevents disappointment. He opened a small paper envelope from his pocket, used the edge to lift the pedal and sealed it inside. You carry those around when you're off duty? I carry several things I don't need until I do. Lucy nodded towards the servant's door. Did you know that was there? I found it last night while checking the routes from the study. And? It runs down to the service corridor beside the pantry, then continues to the cellar level. So anyone familiar with the house could move between floors without using the main staircase. Oliver looked towards her. Yes. Neil. He knows the house. Arthur did too. So might Elliot, if he explored while taking photographs. Andrew had access to old plans in the archive. Marcus wanders whenever he can't find a signal, and Henry spent time near the conservatory, which connects to the service corridor. Lucy gave him a look. You've already thought of everyone. I'm trying not to think of only one person. That, Lucy knew, was how weak investigations began. A detail appeared to fit a suspect, and every later fact was forced to follow it. Oliver examined the lock on Arthur's study. There were no scratches around the brass plate and no sign that anyone had inserted a tool. Whoever stood here may not have been trying to enter, he said. What else would they be doing? Checking whether it was still locked, listening, leaving something, taking something from the corridor. Lucy glanced at the sealed envelope in his hand. The flower? Possibly. He stood. I'll ask everyone about the staircase after breakfast. Won't that warn whoever it was? They already know you saw them. Lucy looked towards the dark opening beyond the paneled door. That's reassuring. It wasn't intended to be. They descended the servants' staircase carefully. The steps were narrower than the main stairs and worn slightly at the center from generations of use. At the lower landing, the route split in two. One door opened near the pantry, another led down toward the cellars and boiler room. A faded bellboard remained mounted on the wall, each label corresponding to a room elsewhere in the house. Library, drawing room, dining room, study, bedroom 1, bedroom 2. Most of the wires had been disconnected years ago. One brass indicator, however, hung slightly lower than the rest. Study. Lucy touched the wooden casing beside it. Could this still work? Oliver examined the mechanism. Possibly. The servants would have known when Arthur wanted them. If the line is connected. He followed the thin wire upwards until it disappeared into the ceiling. Lucy looked again at the study label. Something about the idea of a bell being rung from inside a locked room made her uncomfortable, even though there was no reason to assume it had happened. They entered the pantry. Neil Fraser stood at the central counter, slicing bread. He looked from Lucy to Oliver, then towards the open servants' door behind them. You found the back stairs. Apparently someone else found them first, Oliver said. Neil set down the knife. What happened? Oliver explained. Neil's expression tightened as Lucy described the figure outside Arthur's study. Who uses that staircase? Oliver asked. Me, Arthur, the housekeeper when she's here, though she left before the weekend. Anyone else? Guests sometimes discover it. Could someone reach the study from the ground floor without being seen? Neil nodded reluctantly. From the pantry, yes. There's another entrance beside the old music room. Lucy looked towards the loaf beneath his hand. The slices had begun thick and even, but the most recent one had been cut at an angle. Was the bell system still working? She asked. Neil turned towards her. Some of it. The study bell? A pause. I thought so. Oliver noticed the hesitation. When was it last used? Neil looked down at the bread. Yesterday. Lucy felt the room grow still. By Arthur? She asked. Neil nodded. What time? Not long before he died. Oliver opened his notebook. Tell us exactly what happened. Neil drew a slow breath. I was in the kitchen preparing coffee for the presentation. The study indicator dropped. I went upstairs using the servant's staircase. And Arthur was alive? Yes. What did he want? Neil's eyes moved briefly towards Lucy. He asked whether everyone had gathered. That was all? Another hesitation. No. Oliver waited. Neil wiped his hands on a cloth, although there was nothing on them. He asked me to remove one item from the drawing room. What item? The leather folder. Lucy frowned. But the folder was in the study when Arthur was found. I know. Neil's voice had lowered. He told me to bring it upstairs. So you did? Yes. What happened when you reached the study? The door was open. Arthur was at his desk. I handed him the folder. Was anyone else there? No. Did he seem frightened? Neil shook his head. Distracted, perhaps. Not frightened. What time was this? A little after 3. Arthur had been discovered around 3:50. Lucy watched Neil carefully. Grief had deepened the lines around his eyes, but there was something else in his expression now. Guilt. You're leaving something out, she said. Neil looked at her. Oliver did not intervene. For several seconds, Neil seemed to consider denying it. Then his shoulders lowered. Arthur asked me whether the cedar tree could be seen from the study. Lucy and Oliver exchanged a glance. The cedar tree from Elliot's photograph? Lucy asked. Neil nodded. What did you tell him? That it could if the weather was clear enough. And then? He walked to the window and looked towards the gardens. Neil swallowed. He said, then perhaps I was wrong about who came to meet me. The pantry seemed suddenly smaller. Oliver wrote the sentence down with deliberate care. Did he explain? No. Did you ask? I did. And? He said he'd explain with everyone else. Neil looked away. That was the last conversation I had with him. No one spoke for a moment. The faint smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Somewhere deeper in the house, a pipe knocked inside the wall. Lucy thought of Arthur beneath the cedar tree, facing someone outside Elliot's photograph. She thought of the unknown figure outside his study that morning and the pressed petal lying near the lock. Arthur had believed one person came to meet him. Before his death, he had begun to suspect he was wrong. Breakfast gathered the guests around the long table less than an hour later, though the atmosphere differed sharply from the previous mornings. The first shock of Arthur's death had hardened into something more complicated. Fear now existed beside curiosity. Grief sat beside suspicion. Every guest seemed aware that ordinary remarks might be remembered, compared, and eventually used against them. Oliver waited until Neil had poured coffee before explaining what Lucy had seen. Marcus responded first. You saw a figure, but not a face. Yes. And now all of us are expected to account for where we were at 6 in the morning. Oliver remained calm. I'm asking whether anyone used the upstairs corridor or servant's staircase. Marcus spread his hands. I was asleep. Can anyone confirm that? No, Inspector, because I don't generally invite witnesses into my bedroom. Helen Sinclair placed her cup gently into its saucer. Defensiveness does not improve an answer. Marcus looked towards her. Neither does commentary. It improves many things. Andrew glanced between them before speaking. I was awake around 6. Oliver turned. Where? In my room. What woke you? The pipes, I think, or the wind. Did you leave? No. Henry said he had slept until shortly before 7. Evelyn claimed the same, although Lucy noticed her eyes move briefly towards the servant's door when it was mentioned. Elliot looked genuinely surprised by the existence of the staircase. Helen stated that she had been awake from 5:30, but remained in bed reading. Neil had been in the kitchen by 6, though nobody had seen him arrive. Oliver made notes without suggesting conclusions. Then Lucy placed the question that had been growing since the pantry. Did Arthur speak privately to any of you in the gardens? The reactions were subtle, but they were not identical. Andrew frowned with open confusion. Marcus looked irritated. Evelyn lowered her eyes towards her coffee. Henry became very still. Helen watched the others before answering. Elliot's hand tightened around the camera strap resting beside his chair. One reaction mattered more than the others. Neil looked directly at Henry Shaw. Henry noticed. "So," Lucy said carefully, "someone knows something." Henry set down his cup. "That is a dangerous way to phrase a question." It wasn't a question. Then it was an accusation. No, it was an observation. Oliver looked between them. "Dr. Shaw, did you speak with Arthur in the gardens?" Henry's expression remained controlled. Briefly. The room changed at once. Marcus leaned forward. "You told us you were with me in the conservatory." "I was. For part of the afternoon." "You neglected to mention this?" Henry looked towards Oliver. "You asked where I spent most of my time. I answered." "That isn't quite the same as telling the whole truth," Helen said. Henry's jaw tightened slightly. No. It was the first time Lucy had seen discomfort break through his professional composure. "What did Arthur want?" Oliver asked. Henry looked around the table, perhaps judging how much could still be withheld now that the meeting itself was known. "He asked me about Amelia." Lucy felt the name settle over them. "What about her?" she asked. Henry did not answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice had become quieter. "He wanted to know whether I remembered the night she came into my hospital." No one moved. Andrew stared at him. "You treated her?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell us?" Henry looked towards Arthur's empty chair at the head of the table. "Because what she told me was confidential." "Arthur is dead," Marcus said, "and Amelia died 10 years ago. Confidentiality does not vanish simply because it becomes inconvenient." Oliver leaned forward slightly. "Did what Amelia told you relate to Arthur's death?" Henry's eyes lifted to meet his. "I don't know." "That isn't an answer. It is the only honest answer I have." Lucy watched him carefully. Henry was frightened now. He hid it well, but she recognized the signs. The careful breathing, the overly controlled tone, the way he kept both hands flat against the table to prevent them moving. "What did she tell you?" Lucy asked. Henry's gaze shifted towards her. "She said someone had been following her." Silence overtook the room. Outside, the mist finally began to lift from the gardens, revealing the dark shape of the cedar tree beyond the rain-bright glass. Henry looked towards it. "And yesterday afternoon, Arthur asked me whether I remembered the name she gave me." For several long moments, nobody around the breakfast table spoke. The only sound came from the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall and the distant cry of gulls circling above the cliffs outside. Morning sunlight, weak but determined, filtered through the rain-speckled windows and settled across the polished table, illuminating abandoned cups of coffee that had long since begun to cool. Henry Shaw remained perfectly still. He seemed to understand that every eye in the room now rested upon him. Marcus finally broke the silence. "You mean to tell us Amelia believed someone was following her?" He leaned forward. "And you've kept that to yourself for 10 years? Henry met his gaze calmly. "I kept it because she asked me to." Marcus gave a disbelieving laugh. "She's dead." "So is Arthur." Henry's reply came quietly. "That doesn't lessen my responsibility." Helen Sinclair spoke before Marcus could answer. "It does raise another question." Henry turned towards her. "If Amelia truly believed somebody was following her, why wasn't it reported?" Henry drew a slow breath. "It was." That answer surprised everyone. Lucy looked up immediately. "It was?" Henry nodded. "I encouraged her to report it to the police." "And did she?" "I believe she intended to." "You believe?" "I never asked what happened afterwards." Lucy frowned. "You never followed it up?" Henry looked almost ashamed. "I should have." His voice carried genuine regret. "I assumed the matter had been resolved." Andrew rubbed a hand across his forehead. "So Arthur knew Amelia had been frightened before she died?" Henry nodded. "Yes." "And yesterday he wanted to know if you remembered the name she gave you?" "Correct." Oliver looked thoughtfully towards the notebook lying open beside his plate. Did you remember it? Henry remained silent. Marcus noticed immediately. You did. Another pause. Then Henry nodded once. I remembered. Lucy felt her heartbeat quicken. What was the name? Henry looked around the table. His expression had become unexpectedly conflicted. It wasn't a name. Everyone stared at him. It was a pair of initials. Lucy immediately thought of Amelia's portrait. C.H. Henry slowly shook his head. No. The room seemed to tighten. What initials? Oliver asked him. Henry hesitated. I don't know whether they mean anything. They meant enough for Arthur to ask. Yes. So tell us. Henry looked down at the table. The initials were... He paused. E.B. No one reacted immediately. Lucy simply repeated them silently inside her own mind. E.B. Then she realized, very slowly. Her eyes moved towards the far end of the table, towards Elliot Brooks. He looked genuinely bewildered. Marcus noticed the movement first. Oh, you've got to be kidding. Elliot frowned. What? Your initials. Elliot stared back at him. So? So? Marcus pushed his chair backwards. They're your initials. Oliver immediately raised a hand. Nobody jumps to conclusions. Marcus looked incredulous. I'm not jumping anywhere. He pointed towards Elliot. We've just heard that Amelia gave Henry the initials E.B. 10 years ago. He looked around the table, and sitting right there is Elliot Brooks. Elliot remained remarkably composed. My surname isn't unusual. No. Helen agreed. It isn't. She looked thoughtfully towards Henry. Did Amelia ever explain what those initials represented? Henry answered immediately. No. Did she describe the person? No. So they may not refer to a person at all. Henry nodded. They could refer to a company, a location, a ship, anything. Marcus sat back down, though he still looked unconvinced. Lucy watched Elliot carefully. She expected anger or defensiveness. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost disturbed. Oliver noticed the same thing. Mr. Brooks. Elliot looked up. Had you ever heard Amelia Pembroke's name before receiving Arthur's invitation? No. You've never met Arthur? No. Never corresponded with him? No. Oliver studied him for several seconds. I believe you. Marcus laughed. Based on what? Oliver answered without taking his eyes off Elliot. His surprise. Marcus shook his head. People fake surprise. They do. Oliver finally looked towards him, but very few fake confusion. Lucy quietly wrote those words into her notebook. Surprise and confusion are different things. Arthur would have appreciated that distinction. Breakfast ended without anyone finishing it. One by one, the guests drifted into the drawing room, each carrying their own thoughts. The atmosphere inside Ravensmere House had shifted again. Yesterday, everyone had wondered who might have killed Arthur. Today, they had begun wondering why Amelia had been frightened long before her death. Lucy found herself standing once more beneath Amelia's portrait. The pressed flower between the pages suddenly seemed different. Not simply sentimental, intentional. Arthur had wanted every guest to see it. Oliver joined her a few moments later. What are you thinking? Lucy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked towards the gallery above. I think we've been asking the wrong question. Oliver folded his arms. Go on. We keep asking who killed Arthur. Naturally. But Arthur wasn't investigating his own murder. Oliver remained silent. He was investigating Amelia. She looked back towards the portrait. I think Arthur invited us here because he finally discovered what happened to her. Oliver considered the idea, and somebody believed he was about to tell us. Lucy nodded. I don't think Arthur was the original target. Oliver's expression changed almost imperceptibly. You think Amelia was... I think she always was. The words hung heavily between them. For the first time since Arthur's death, the mystery no longer felt like one murder. It felt like two. A sudden crash echoed somewhere inside the house. Both Lucy and Oliver turned immediately. The sound had come from the west wing. Not loud enough to suggest violence, but unmistakably the sound of something heavy striking a wooden floor. Oliver was already moving. Lucy followed close behind. They hurried along the upper gallery before turning into a corridor neither of them had explored before. The west wing felt noticeably colder than the rest of Ravensmere House. The wallpaper had faded with age, while several rooms stood locked behind heavy oak doors that looked as though they had remained unopened for years. The noise had come from the final room overlooking the cliffs. Its door stood ajar. Oliver slowed. He placed one hand gently against the wood before pushing it fully open. The room beyond had once been a music room. A grand piano sat beneath dust sheets near the windows, while shelves of faded sheet music lined one wall. One tall bookcase had collapsed across the floor. Books lay scattered everywhere. Lucy looked around. No one's here. Oliver frowned. They were. He pointed towards the open French doors leading onto a narrow stone balcony. Rainwater glistened across the flagstones outside. Fresh footprints crossed the wet surface. Only one set, leading away from the room, not towards it. Lucy stepped carefully to the doorway. The footprints disappeared around the corner of the balcony, where an external staircase descended towards the gardens below. Whoever had been there had only just left. Then Lucy noticed something lying beneath the fallen bookcase. Half hidden beneath several old music scores was a small leather notebook. Unlike everything else in the room, it wasn't dusty. Oliver crouched carefully. Without touching it, he leaned close enough to read the name embossed in fading gold letters across the cover. He looked up at Lucy. His voice was little more than a whisper. It belonged to Amelia.